Welcome to the Aviation Safety Community podcast, presented by the aviation safety community. This podcast follows a series of conversations with your host, Grenville Hudson, and field experts to discuss aviation safety, the latest trends, and industry insights.
Oh, hello, and welcome to another Aviation Safety Community podcast. And I have with me Jerry Allen, who's a senior advisor with the Just Culture Company. Jerry works in workplace environments, or improving workplace environments through work accountability, root cause analysis, and reliable outcome models. Jerry has a proven capability in implementation of just culture in high-risk industries. Jerry, how are you going?
Oh, good. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. Appreciate that.
No worries. Jerry, look, maybe you could just give us a bit of a background of yourself and some of the projects you're working on at the moment or have been in the past. Be quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. As a part of the Just Culture Company, we've been involved in this space for roughly the last 27 years, give or take a year or so, with regard to collaborating with high-risk industries, as you referred to in the introduction. Way back in the day, we started principally in healthcare, aviation, and there were a few other odds and end groups that were a part of the first symposium we did in what we called back then high consequence industries. And that was, of course, healthcare, aviation. I think there were a few energy folks. There might have been a few nuclear folks, and even an odd pipeline person that was in the group at the time when we did the original symposium. But we did the first few. I assisted David Marks in delivering those, and this was back in probably the 96, 97 timeframe, just to really validate the model that we were, talking about at the time and that David had developed, which is the same model actually that I'll talk about in our work today, just to really sort of test out give it a run around the track, so to speak, and we found that the model was very valid for helping people not only understand, but judge more fairly a wide range of behaviors that they would encounter in the workplace across a range of situations, not only safety outcomes, but also around, breaches of basic values between, one person to another. So the model can accommodate, the model is not outcome based, as you'll hear me say over and over again. It is quality of choice based. So anytime we're either looking at something through the lens of an outcome that's happened or simply looking at, where conduct between two people was not what we wanted or what we expected, then the model's in play.
Right. Are you able to give us a bit of a quick or brief overview of how the model works?
Sure. We have what we call a 5-behavior model, and it contemplates a range of choice and admitting and acknowledging right up front that human error is what we would call the lowest culpability part of the model. And it is not a choice, of course, because by definition, human error is unintentional. But the rest of the model being at-risk behavior, reckless conduct, behavior with knowledge and purpose to cause harm, those 4 are choice. And so when we talk about the spectrum of human behavior, it is kind of working left to right, if you want to visualize it, that, we start with, unintended error, right, where someone simply did something other than what they intended to do. And then we talk about choice being first and foremost at-risk behavior, where either somebody doesn't recognize the risk that they're taking or they think they're in a safe space is the way we often say it, right? Technically we define it as where someone does not recognize the risk or mistakenly believes it to be justified. But we all drift, right? And that's a term we use very frequently when we talk about high consequence events and industries where there's always the potential for those high consequence events, is that, we do our best to set up work systems to accommodate human fallibility, but at the same time, we understand that people will drift into risky choices. And that's one of the basic tenets of our view of just culture, is that, organizations have an obligation to design good systems, and frankly, as good systems as they can given their constraints. But at the same time, we understand anytime we put fallible people into those systems, eventually people will drift. And sometimes that's because they're overconfident or overcomfortable with the conditions that they work in every day. They've done things relatively the same way over a course of time, and there's not been harm associated with those things, so they get reinforced. And so drift is a part of the normal human condition, if we can use that term. The other three, reckless, knowledge, and purpose, are pretty high culpability. I mean, recklessness by definition is a conscious choice to disregard risk and disregard the potential for harm. And even in legal constructs, recklessness is usually the threshold for consideration of higher culpability sanction. Knowledge and purpose, which are the remaining two in the model, are, really where there's not only a high degree of consciousness, but much more towards, especially for the highest culpability piece here, purpose to harm. That's almost premeditation, right? Where I want to harm someone, I make a plan to do it, and I carry it out, right? So that's pretty high on in fact, from a legal perspective, that's the highest level of culpability that you can achieve, if achieves the right word, right?
It's interesting, and I was thinking, like, you've actually worked in Australia, haven't you? You've actually done some work in Australia, and that's been in the just culture area, hasn't it?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, it was about 17 years ago now, actually, if I do the math, which just keeps me reminded that I'm getting on in years. But yeah, it's been a while.
So you would have come up against the Australian workplace norms, and I guess one of them is, like, we have this Fair Work Commission, and we have enterprise bargaining agreements and all that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering how you would see this model fitting in with those types of that side of the employment situation here in Australia.
Yeah, I guess a couple of thoughts there. I mean, one, back in the day, it wasn't necessarily within our remit to, as we were talking about earlier, to kind of build that bridge between labor and management of the organization at the time. But we were trying to create a common language set, which I think was very important in terms of understanding the model, because any time you can get to a place where there's a better or more common understanding of what a breach of duty really is in the context of the organization, regardless of what it says in the enterprise bargaining agreement, right? I mean, I did a few investigations helping in that day, helping the client look into why, and the term I just used in describing the model was drift, looking at why, where we identified some significant drift in the organization, why was it occurring, right? Was it due to individual choice? Was it due to work systems? Was it due to both? And in fact, we discovered a number of instances where there was, pretty risky stuff going on, but at the same time, this model and this language set and this, I'd call it a mutual desire for justice, if I can use that term, did exist, because the unions were engaged and they wanted to, do their part to help reduce risk where possible. Of course, against a legal structure and a backdrop where it was often contentious about, whether or not it was the right thing to do to take disciplinary action against a member, but against the model, it kind of takes that and puts it on the side and says, let's just talk a common language about the choices people made. And that became the important objective, is to try to establish that common language set.
Yeah. So in some ways, there seems to be like there has to be some level of buy-in, though, from labour, and in a highly unionised environment, that seems pretty important. Yeah.
Well, it's essential. Yeah. I mean, and it has to start from day one, and that was part of our strategic roadmap with regard to that change plan for the whole organization, is how do we bring the unions along at the same time as the management of the organization and get them all, collectively to try to hold that mirror up and say, how are we contributing to the risk in this organization, and what can we do about it? Yeah.
And there's this ever pervading terms of negligence and what's reasonable. Is that something you might be able to help us with?
Well, I'll just share our perspective from the Just Culture Company view, is that there regardless of whether we're talking about Australasia, whether you're talking about Europe and the UK, whether you're talking about the US, there is usually a fairly widely held misunderstanding about what recklessness is, and sorry, but negligence is.
Mm.
Um, there's different degrees of negligence, right? There's what you would call ordinary negligence, which is, in most Western law systems, equivalent to human error. Um, when you start talking about reckless conduct, then you get into something typically described as gross negligence. And when we talk about that, then again, that fits in our model from a legal descriptive perspective, but also it helps people understand that, there's different kinds of negligence, and that is something that you have to be aware of as you get into the judgment space. Is, human error is not culpable in that model, right? It's not
Okay.
culpable in ours, and it should not be culpable in most Western law systems.
And we use this term, what a reasonable person would do, or what is that also involved in your model, like reasonability or?
Yeah, absolutely. We lean heavily when we sort of try to help people become better judges, which is part of our task when we train people on our view of just culture. Inevitably, especially if you're in a management role, you have to put on your judge hat occasionally, and you have to judge your own employees and possibly even others in terms of the conduct that they engaged in. And as we teach them how to do that more effectively, we lean heavily into the application of both the subjective, which is the person's view, what do they know, think, and believe, but we also lean very heavily into the objective, which is that reasonable person test. And so it's always a comparative look. We don't, we say, because we're not trying to prove in court, through evidence what somebody did or did not do, which is the subjective, legal perspective on the world. The objective piece, though, is simply would others have done the same thing, and would they have seen the same risks? And both of those are very important questions. And so, yeah, but we never do one without the other. We always advocate the subjective and objective together to give you that view of whether they converge or diverge. And typically, the more they diverge, then you're pointing more towards the higher culpability levels of conduct.
Right. And like no blame culture, it's a term that's used a lot in aviation safety management and that. But where do you see this going, like no blame and just culture? Do they complement each other, or are they totally independent?
Our view is no blame is outdated and just needs to go away. Pardon me for being direct, but
yeah,
this issue of no blame, it carries some baggage because of decades of history where we say in the safety space, as long as you hold up your hand and turn in that that report about what you did or what you almost did, there'll be no blame. That's historically been the context. We would simply say in our model, no blame would very, very roughly equate to human error, where we would say it was unintended conduct. Maybe you did something inadvertently that you didn't intend to do. And our model would accommodate that to say, accept that human fallibility and fix your system, right? So that's our view on the no blame world. But that term no blame really does need to go away, because that sort of alludes organizationally that as long as you hold up your hand and put in that report, nothing's going to happen to you. Well, what if you engage in a very risky choice, right? What if you behave recklessly? Then you should stand accountable. So, our model is about shared accountability. It's not about no blame, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I manage some safety operations and that, and I find a lot of people use this no blame culture in sort of like the father confessor type thing. They report it thinking that once they've reported it, that's it. They've already got forgiveness, so to speak.
Right.
But
you've gone into the booth and you've confessed and you're clean.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. But I think you're right. Well, I know you're right in what you're saying, that there's another side to this that you have to look at, and people have to be aware that there are consequences for their actions. So,
well, you referenced the sort of the union angle of use of just culture and use of this model earlier, and even in heavily unionized organizations where there might even be an acrimonious relationship between labor and management,
Mm.
in our experience over the decades, we've never encountered an organization that says, we want a blank check for our members. They can do whatever they want. They can,
Yeah.
engage in reckless conduct or very risky conduct. And, you know,
Yeah.
everyone has said we believe there should be lines of accountability out there,
Yeah.
right?
And
Even
I
within
think, yeah, and I
cultures.
think the unions are just as hot on this as what you're saying. That my experience with unions is that they just don't want people to get away with pure negligence at the end of the day. They want
Well,
people to be
yeah,
accountable.
and our experience in healthcare recently has kind of illustrated that, in one particular large system, they shared data with us that their rates of grievance uh, have gone down by about 50%. Right. So,
Right.
in terms of wrongful termination and those sorts of grievances, we can see a direct correlation between, where there's better transparency and use of this model, then there's some mutual benefit, not only to the employees because they avoid the wrongful termination, trauma that they have to go through when that happens, and employers avoid all the negativity and associated
Mm.
with that as well. So yeah, there's some correlation between effect, a better way to do it being
Yeah.
a better system of workplace justice and some good outcomes for both individuals and organizations.
And so, in terms of safety culture, and how do you see just culture fitting in with safety culture?
But the analogy we often use is just culture has to be basically a motherboard. I mean, it's got to be what you wire a lot of things into, right?
Yeah.
Because it goes right down to how effectively is an organization at applying their values, right? And in particular, how does that shape the culture of the organization? From a safety perspective, yes,
Mm.
every high consequence organization has to have a strong safety culture or they won't be in business, right?
Mm.
But
Absolutely.
also about how people treat each other, right?
Yeah.
Parts of the world they use different words, but collegiality and respect are two that often come to mind about the sort of the targets that organizations will strive for with regard to use of the model and trying to impact their values moving in the right direction.
Mm. And so, I guess, from a systems management point of view, for safety systems management, the just culture model sits squarely in that, doesn't it? At the end of the day.
Yeah, and how it's defined in terms of what it should look like and some of the phraseology used and vary by regulatory entities around the world. EASA has a lot of descriptive words about what they think just culture ought to be. In the U.S., when you talk about safety management, there's very little that's actually defined. In other parts of the world, there are attempts to sort of better define it, but I think that's one of the challenges going forward is that we have to do a much better job defining what it is and how it's applied, and really train regulatory agencies or national aviation authorities particularly to embrace the application of just culture within the context of an organization. I mean, in the U.S., just one example, the aviation safety action programs that exist in the United States to facilitate, open reporting and a sort of that three-legged stool where management, labor, and the regulator all sit around a table after a near miss has happened or an adverse safety event has happened and attempt to be just and fair. They attempt to actually apply justice, but the problem is there's no consistent understanding of what that looks like
Yeah.
across those three entities, right? So there are challenges, and we would say probably in the aviation space, EASA is further down the road, um, but they haven't gone nearly as far as we had hoped because they published regulation back in 2014, I believe, if I remember right, around just culture and provided some additional guidance material on that.
Mm.
But legally speaking and from a terminology perspective, it was a bit of a mess in terms of
Yeah.
how it clarified the application of just culture because in fact it just really muddied the water, and I'm sure
Yeah.
my EASA friends will lob grenades over at me if they hear us talk That's okay.
I've heard you use this term restorative justice. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a popular one too these days. When depending on whether folks out there have read Sidney Decker, for example, he's a big restorative justice person. Um, we teach the concept in the sense of there's right times in our model, even if you're talking about conduct more towards the higher end of the culpability spectrum. There are right terms for what we call application of mercy, grace, and forgiveness. And yes, those are theological terms, but they have a context and a role to play in the sense of how management, in particular, or managers can engage in the rehabilitation process to help people come back into the workspace after they've been involved in something. Um, Historically, we simply said, the life cycle of an event is, the time from which it happens till the time an employee is brought back into the workspace in good condition, right, mentally and physically, right?
Yeah.
And so there's definitely a view in our model of just culture that even though we might say you engaged in one of the higher levels of culpability conduct, there is a place where managers can say we don't think it's the right course of action to take severely punitive action against them. We think sometimes rehabilitating them because they've got value, because we identified significant system problems, combination of all those. There are times and places where you make a decision to take a less culpable, application or part of the model as a sanction, and focus more on bringing an employee back into the workplace in good mental and physical condition. And that's just value, right? That's value for the employee, that's value for the organization, and ultimately that's what's just and fair. And so, although we don't really, lean heavily into the term restorative justice, we do believe in restoration for sure.
And so it sounds to me like one of the key features of all this is setting the rules. And so every organisation is going to be different, isn't it, as to what the rules are? Or is there like an overarching platform that they have to work to?
Well, we don't think of them as rules per se, but we do think about, we do encourage organizations to think, uh, give sort of a thoughtful, I call it thoughtful deliberation, right? To thoughtfully deliberate when they're going to use our just culture model, our just culture algorithm. What's the process for that? What are going to be the thresholds or the triggers that cue that whole process up? So maybe I don't think about them as rules, but we do want to make sure that organizations develop their own set of triggers to say, if certain classes of events happen, if certain, things just point us to the fact that somebody made a risky choice, we have to have a process in place where we can consistently apply just culture. The best practice over the years has been simply a concept we've called event review groups, where there's a cross-functional, multidisciplinary team that agrees to oversee application of just culture, using the model, using the algorithm, and using it as the basis for judgment. And that event review group process has been sound over the decades and will continue to be. I've helped people set those up. I've chartered them. I've refereed a few. I've done a lot of work in that space, and we know that when you start talking about application, that's definitely a best practice. Is how does that play itself out in a particular organization?
And how long do you see, putting a just culture system into place within an organisation? What sort of time frame are you looking at with that sort of thing?
When we talk about an initial implementation roadmap with a medium to large size organization, we usually give them a package of work that, in a absence pandemics and things that significantly skew the timelines, we're usually talking about 2 years, 1 to 2 years.
Okay.
If they move aggressively, I'd say one. If they are a typical organization that has lots of other initiatives going on simultaneously, it's definitely a first 2 year roadmap. We've seen implementation efforts, span 2 to 5 to even 7 years. Right?
Yeah. Right. So when do you know you're at it? When do you know you've reached this just culture nirvana?
You're never there.
I thought that'd be
Well,
the answer.
yeah, yeah. Well, what we say is, we do say you're never there because, unfortunately, you're only one bad transaction away from
Mm,
doing some damage.
yeah.
And we've seen that occasionally, but I would say, if anything, when an organization can see both leading and lagging indicators that suggest to them that either in actuality there's less risk happening in their business quantifiably that they can put their finger on, then that's
Mm,
one marker of success. Things like reduction in grievances, that'd be another great marker of
right.
success, right? So
Yeah.
there are things that kind of flag you on the journey that says, hey, we're doing better, right?
Yeah.
Even if you have less instances of bullying, harassment, intimidation, that sort of thing, that's another marker if you've tied it directly to your just culture implementation. So,
Yeah.
again, since we talk about the safety space for sure, but we also, the reduction in adverse events can indicate, a healthy trend in the right direction. But even just treating each other more aligned with the organization's values is a
Yeah.
positive indicator as well.
Yeah. I find it absolutely fascinating. I think it's an area that every organisation has to try to embrace in some way, shape, or form. I know a lot of us try to do it on our own, but obviously
Mhm.
there's a company like yours that can actually give assistance and guidance and bring that model into play. No, that's really fascinating. And the future, what are you looking at in the future for yourself in terms of developing things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, right now, what's in front of us is, and it's a good thing, but I think it's indicative of where we're at in the course of history. But the pandemic has really created a lot of sort of pent up demand. So we're seeing an increase in people sort of returning back to the just culture space now that they've got some ability to breathe. In particular, in
Yeah,
healthcare, you know, very direct correlation in terms of bandwidth and the ability to now step back and say, okay, we made it through that. Let's get back to the path that we wanted to in terms of how we
mm,
become the organization that we want it to be. I think the near term challenge for aviation is just to get out of that. It's only about safety space.
mm,
That that's the headspace that aviation still kind of sits in, and you know, again, it has to be a given, and safety culture has to be a given in order to operate effectively as a good business, and we fully acknowledge and support that. But you know, our model is value centric, right? So wherever an
mm,
organization wants to get better around its collective value set and how people not only how are people making decisions in the context of safety, but how are people treating each other, and is the organization aspirationally becoming what it wants to be?
yeah. And I think all airlines have gone through quite a bit of a shake-up, and
Mm-hmm.
I think there's huge issues with labour, either in the process of happening or about to happen. I think with so many pilots leaving the industry, so many players within the industry leaving the industry, and then we've got new people coming in on board, and we've got challenges finding people, and then there's just this recreation of the actual culture that you had before the pandemic, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not too sure, but yeah, it's a
Yeah.
huge challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's sort of bastions that we would like to work, more and more in. The discussion earlier about labor, just historically sort of takes me back and just
Mm.
makes me reminded of the fact that's a real fertile field if we were really to collectively get into it and really work with
Mm.
some of the larger labor organizations at the national and international level. I mean, that there would be I think a ton of opportunity there, but also some really great work if we could all roll up our sleeves and do it together. But
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really fantastic. Look, Jerry, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I know you're in a different time zone there in the US, and we appreciate the fact that you've stayed up to have a chat with us. Look, we look forward to talking with you again soon. And if anyone really wants to look at the Just Culture model that Jerry's talked about, we just recently released a safety forum with Jerry on this very topic, and it is available on our website, the aviationsafetycommunity.com.au, and please visit us and see what we've got there. There's a lot of other things too that might be of interest. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jerry, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
You got it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Aviation Safety Community podcast. Please don't forget to visit our website, www.aviationsafetycommunity.com.au. We'll see you in the next episode.